session, which is really focused on enforceable policies. We have two speakers today. One is Liz Ruther. Thank you. Oregon's coastal state, she is Oregon's coastal state federal relations coordinator. And also Chris Wall, who is with the NOAA Office of Coastal Management. She is our regional coastal management specialist. So welcome to both of you. And I will remind you also to speak closely into the mic. Chris was commenting earlier she's used to talking while standing.
Yeah, we both are. That's really interesting. We'll be fidgeting over here and talking at the same time. Good afternoon. I'm not sure who put us after the potatoes, but we'll do our best. If you just stand up, please do. It's a very wonky topic. I am Liz Ruther, and I am the Coastal State Federal Relations Coordinator, but basically that means I work with federal consistency reviews. And if you don't know what that means, that's okay, because that's what this is all about.
And Chris Wall, I'm with NOAA. Specifically, I'm in NOAA's Office for Coastal Management, which is under the National Ocean Service. So please don't ask me about fish or salmon. I don't know anything about it, I'm sorry. But if you want to know about oceans or you want to know about coastal policy, that is my world. I work West Coast wide with a primary focus on supporting the Oregon and Washington state coastal management programs and being their primary liaison between the NOAA program and what the state's doing. When you hear about how policies or authorities in the state are ultimately parts of the territorial sea plan will go to NOAA for approval, that's me in my office. I'm not the final person who has the say, but I'm your first line of defense and also communication to explain what it means locally and why it's critical here, and really trying to make what you guys want to do work to be something we can approve and be that intermediary and ideally a local way. And I know that Jack said he goes to social gatherings to ask, or when he's at social gatherings, he will ask if you know about ocean acidification or hypoxia, and that's increasing. I'm not sure that's the same if I went and asked, what do you know about federal consistency? But hopefully today, you guys will walk out knowing more than you did before. And that's really the point, understanding what federal consistency is and why you guys should care, why it applies to OPAC.
And we'll try to unravel the mystery of the phrase enforceable policy. And before I start, I just realized that today is my 2-year anniversary of starting with the program, so I just wanted to point that out. It's a group. This is a group project when it comes to federal consistency. So I'm always calling Chris and Patty and Steve are kind of like the think tank when it comes to federal consistency and enforceable policies. So really, if either one of you have something to say or clarify, please do.
And as a reminder, if it's, I apologize, I'm realizing with the other presentations too, some of the text is quite small for those of you that have packets, this is in there as well. So just if you want to take notes or see it better. But just a quick reminder, this all relates to the Coastal Zone Management Act, which was a federal authority of 1972. And the key point I want to make here is under the Coastal Zone Management Act, it established a federal-state partnership, and it's voluntary. And so this creates state coastal programs and national estuarine research reserves. Oregon was one of the first programs approved by NOAA in 1976. And as a side note, the South Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve in Coos Bay was the very first estuarine research reserve approved under that program, both under the CZMA. But this is a voluntary program, and it's non-regulatory. So states can choose to join the National Coastal Management Program by developing a state program adhering to what's laid out under the CZMA. And if they want to do that, they get annual federal funding from us. They get technical and policy assistance from us, and then they get this federal consistency authority from NOAA as part of the program. States can choose not to join, and they can choose to leave, and we have seen that in all cases around the country where we had a program that was part of it and they left, and we had some that hadn't joined initially and then joined decades after the other ones did. But I think what's noteworthy, and we've highlighted it in yellow because we're going to focus on it today, is that federal consistency authority. This is really unique, and we're going to explain it next and what it means. But we've had other states jokingly say, we would join your program just for the federal consistency authority. I mean, the money's nice, but we'll take just this authority, and that's why it's worth understanding. Oregon gets roughly $1.4 million annually right now under our coastal land management program. They used to get closer to $2 million, and I'm not going to dwell on that, but hopefully we can get them back to full funding again this year. related, different issue. Oregon's program is really a network program. It works across all the different state agencies that you see represented here and have heard about, and local jurisdictions. And the coastal zone extends out to those 3 nautical miles we've been talking about here, but also up to the crest of the coastal range. So that's the entire coastal zone where it applies. And the authorities include the state statutes, the land use planning goals, statewide the territorial sea plan components, and also all the local plans.
And so when we say network, we mean the 11 other state agencies that would include 8 counties on the coast and 32 cities. And so it's a large program.
So what is federal consistency? Liz and I describe it differently, so we're going to both do it so that I think I'll put my federal lens and she'll put the one that actually makes sense for me. But it's a really powerful tool. This is incredibly unique in any federal authority that I've seen, which it allows states to apply state policies to federal activities and actions. So it's really designed to promote cooperation between state and federal agencies and activities and sort of early coordination. So that if a federal agency is doing a project themselves or they're permitting a project, it's really meant to bring in that state early. And it allows the state to use their policies to review and have influence over that federal activity. There is nothing else like this in the world of federal law that I can point to. And that's why we've seen other programs extremely excited to have this authority and want to make the most of it. It's review, a federal consistency review that Liz gets to do every day is based on approved, NOAA has to approve these enforceable policies of the state.
Sure, and so the less legally accurate phrase that I like to use when I'm trying to communicate what I do is that our program with the enforceable policies is kind of like a filter. I feel like it's kind of like a filter that federal activities have to go through or that they do go through with me, that we talk about, and we can get our interests kind of listened to and heard through that filter.
I think the point is it really amplifies the value of state policies. You have state policies that apply at state level to review activities happening within areas where you have jurisdiction. But federal consistency really amplifies the importance of good and well-written state policies. It lets you use them in circumstances where you wouldn't otherwise be allowed to.
So what do I do every day? So that's great, that's what federal consistency means, but what does that translate into? And really, I feel that I am a broker, and I do coordinate between the different state agencies and the counties and the local jurisdictions for these federal activities. And so the OCMP, the Coastal Management Program, lives in DLCD. DLCD coordinates and administers the process. And we must follow specific procedural requirements that are outlined in federal law in federal regulation. And we review federal activities, whether those are direct federal actions or development projects or an applicant seeking a federal permit for coastal impacts in 5 categories: the natural resources, recreation and access, cultural, aesthetic, and economic. And so there's a coastal effects evaluation that occurs. And then we do an enforceable policies analysis, and so does the applicant. So whether it's a federal agency or an applicant for a federal permit, they do an analysis as well. I'm looking for alignment with the policies of the program, and so it's kind of important to ask which policies. And so certainly we have our foundational documents that build the coastal program, and we've been talking a lot about those this morning. And everything, all the documents incorporated into our program can be used, and any policy therein can be used as a recommendation. But you start getting into the musts and shalls with the enforceable policies. So I'll make sure I don't skip ahead. Aha.
I think you're perfect.
Aha, I'm right there, okay. And so enforceable policies must be approved by NOAA because they have to meet certain criteria, and we're not going to get into the criteria today, but it's a process of analyzing different policies that are found in different, whether it's state statute or comprehensive plans or a zoning ordinance. We have to have a clear standard that can be applied or used to that activity.
So an enforceable policy has to be legally binding under state law. So you can't just write a policy that's great and lays everything out if you have no way to actually administer that policy and make it enforceable. So it has to be legally binding. You have to have a mechanism to carry out that policy in the state. And so typically that's found in statutes, regulations, or approved local plans, I think is what I meant to say. And it has to have a clear standard that can be applied or used, something that she can use to do her reviews with. And then the last step to be able to use it for the Federal Consistency Authority, which is where this enforceable policy term really stems from, is it has to be approved by us using those criteria that she said.
So I'm a really visual person, and so here is an example of an actual enforceable policy, and my little circles. So you can see that the program is made up of the largest, all three circles: foundational documents and state laws and planning goals and local laws and ordinances that we've incorporated into the program that have gotten approval by NOAA. And the enforceable bits, or the enforceable policies, are specific sentences, are specific policies, are specific parts of ordinances that are applicable to our program or that we want to use during federal consistency review to make sure that our coastal resources are being used wisely in the same way that we would use them as a state. And so I use ORS 506, 109, the food fish management policy is an example in gold. A big standout for anything that's usually enforceable is the word shall or must, and certainly this has it in there. Food fish shall be managed to provide the optimum economic, commercial, recreational, and civic benefits to present and future generations. One thing that's important to note about enforceable policies is that they can be broad. This is broadly stated, of course, and that during my work, I usually talk with the applicant or federal agency about other management measures or other guidelines that the state has that would bring that project into alignment with this enforceable policy.
So there's one more layer of benefit and complication that we're going to explain to you before we really get into like why you care about this. So hang with us here because this matters too. When a state has an approved coastal program and they have approved enforceable policies, they get to review projects that are within their coastal zone. And in Oregon, I described that's from the crest of the coastal range out to 3 nautical miles. That's the state's coastal zone. So when a state has federal consistency authority, that's the zone they get to review in always under the federal consistency authority. There's also a tool called Geographic Location Descriptions, or GLDs, and this allows any state coastal program to describe a geography, an area outside of their coastal zone where they also would like to be able to review federal activities. And then you can describe, the way a GLD works is it has to be proposed to us and approved by us. And you describe the area of interest, and you describe the activity that would be occurring in that area that you're interested in reviewing, and then you have to provide a justification as to why you would reasonably foreseeable coastal effects in that area. And you provide that package to NOAA, and if we approve it, now the state has authority to review in that additional geographic area beyond their coastal zone. So for example,
Oregon has the Marine Renewable Energy GLD. And we can have multiple GLDs. So it doesn't need to stop at the one we have. They can have different shapes and different sizes depending on the use that we're interested in, right? So this geographic location description is going to allow us to review for federal consistency projects that are outside of the territorial sea for marine renewable energy. And if there were other uses, whether it be aquaculture outside of the territorial sea, since we were talking about that this morning as an example, or others, we could create one.
that's you. What does this mean? You get the element.
So what does this mean? Okay. So that's the process. So far, gotten through the process of in kind of the structure of federal consistency. So what does this mean? It means that we have the authority when we make a decision to concur with a federal action or activity or object to it. If we object to it, per se, if you apply that to a federal permit, that federal permit cannot be issued. In our decision, if the applicant or the federal agency disagrees, they can appeal to the U.S. Secretary of Commerce. So there are appeal options if the decision disagreed with. We also have the option to provide a concurrence with conditions. So it's saying that if you, first of all, we always like to just give concurrences. So when there's a lot of talking and working together during the entire federal consistency review process. However, if we can't come to an agreement, our decision may include a condition that says, hey, we pretty much agree if you would apply these conditions to your action or to the permit. And if they don't like the conditions, it is treated also as an objection. I think it's an important point to know that if we condition the decision that conditions can't just be willy-nilly or whatever I'm thinking that day, or if I like sea stars that day, you know, something about that. They need to be applied to, or they need to link back to the explicit enforceable policy like the one I listed before on the previous slide. And they have to kind of demonstrate, so if this were applied, if this action, this condition were applied, it would increase consistency with this explicit enforceable policy. And I think that is an appropriate line. Okay. So one day I'm gonna have a really cool infographic that makes federal consistency so easy to understand that you will hardly need me, but I don't. So until then, this is the best I could do. And the part that you're probably most familiar with as the council is the left-hand box, policy planning. You've done that with the territorial sea plan, you've done that with part 5, you're doing that with part 3 right now, work groups, stakeholder meetings, state processes. This is where Andy gets most involved and also in his other work. And you'll see towards the bottom, I have kind of tracked TSB part 5 happenings. So from 2008, 2013, y'all worked really hard on TSB part 5. So then the rest of the boxes have to do with just our program and what I do and what we do as a program behind the scenes. So when we get a finished policy document that we'd like to be a part of our coastal program, we not only submit it to NOAA for incorporation as kind of like that foundational document or a document that's going to guide the program and direct the program, but we analyze it for enforceable policies. And we see if there are any policies in there that protect coastal uses and resources and that we want to use specifically for federal consistency purposes when reviewing, federal actions and activities. So we did that for Part 5 in 2014. We analyzed the document and also in 2014, NOAA approved the incorporation of Part 5 as a whole, and then the enforceable policies in Appendix C. And that is that middle box, program change submission. So that is that whole process with NOAA that we go through. We incorporate the document, we ask for approval. We might dither about whether something is enforceable or not, as we often do. And NOAA reviews and or denies. So sometimes we put things forward to be used as an enforceable policy that they deny is an enforceable policy. Also in 2015, we talked about the marine renewable energy geographic location description, and we supplied that to NOAA through the process that Chris described in 2015. So say then a federal activity occurs now that everyone's done all this work. So there's been all the policy planning, all these policy documents, and they've been submitted to NOAA, they're incorporated into a program, and we have enforceable policies. Federal activity occurs, and that triggers federal consistency review. And that's my job. And we apply the enforceable policies to the activity. And state regulatory processes also occur as well. So this is not a replacement per se for state processes. That would occur anyway. And we use state processes actually to help us demonstrate consistency when it's a DSL authorization or other authorizations from OPRD or DEQ or whatnot. So we actually we use those to help us in our analysis. If everything goes as planned, you have the federal consistency decision that I described that comes out in that last box. So hopefully any issues have been resolved. We've all been able to talk with each other, modify the project, or condition it if it hasn't been modified to our liking. We have all the state authorizations necessary, and then federal permit and or if there's a federal action, it goes forward. What's the next Oh, right. Sure. So what would happen? Actually, so you notice, as you all are aware, Part 5 went to the Court of Appeals in 2014, and then the Court of Appeals made their decision this year. And so we notified NOAA to withdraw Part 5 from the program, which means we can't use Part 5 right now for federal consistency review. So what would happen if a marine renewable energy project filed with FERC tomorrow? None of the policies and standards in Part 5 could be used to review it because the main tool that we have for reviewing projects, that Oregon has for reviewing projects and having a seat at the table outside of the territorial sea is federal consistency review. Certainly the state can object or comment during federal processes, but the federal consistency review gives us a seat at the table and the ability to condition an activity to align with all the work that we've done in the state. So getting Part 5 into our program and getting the enforceable policies approved is critical to actually have these be meaningful outside of the territorial sea. So I think looking back at a letter that Patty had written about Part 5, she had mentioned that there are less protections in place with what was happening with Part 5. It wasn't meant to be controversial. We could have put federal consistency review in parentheses or explained what we meant by when we meant less protections, because I don't have much to apply right now outside of the territorial sea.
And I'll give a specific example here. So the document with the red circle is Appendix C. C. Thank you. I can't even read my own thing yet. Appendix C, which is where, so this is from Part 5 of the Territorial Sea Plan. This is the renewable energy section. And my office had asked that everything that would qualify as an enforceable policy for our program be pulled out, extracted, and copied into here, so it was an easy reference for someone, a federal agency or a federal permittee, to say, now what is it that I have to comply with under this federal consistency authority? It's all in one place under Appendix C. So that's what I circled and pointed to there. But then I pulled out Policy 2B, which is the Fisheries Use Protection Standard. This is a very specific example to show you what doesn't exist anymore here. So, and in my mind, this is a very well written policy that would be easy for Liz to apply in her reviews. So, I shortened it, you see that with the dots, but it says, the following standards must be considered in determining the possible adverse effects of a renewable energy facility might have on fisheries uses. Minimize the displacement of fishers from their traditional fisheries areas, minimize the compaction of fishing effort, minimize the economic impact resulting from the reduction in area, mitigate possible hazards to navigation, and minimize the impact on a particular port or sector of the fishing industry. So this is a policy that was written and put into Part 5, that if a project, marine renewable energy project was proposed in Oregon's territorial sea or even outside of it, but within that GLD boundary, the state would have been able to use this to review, and Liz would have said, does your project minimize this, minimize compaction, minimize economic impact or not? Well, if it doesn't, then it has to be consistent with our state policies under the Federal Consistency Authority. So I just wanted to pull a very specific example for you to see what was a really well-written policy that no longer is a legal policy of the state and therefore cannot be approved by us.
Before you all move on to the future, I saw you raised your hand. Do you have a clarifying question, or
Yes.
is it related to enforceable policies? Or is it?
No, it was about what I did last summer.
Make sure we're not going to Part 5, though.
Well, I just had a question about the process. Now, Part 5 was vacated, and so it no longer applies for the consistency, federal consistency. If it's reinstated, then how much time would it take to have it put back in place federally?
It depends how much it changes, but from my understanding, like Appendix C is not changing very much, right? So it would depend on that, and then preparing the documents to provide to NOAA, and then how long do you guys take to review?
90 to 120 days.
90 to 100.
Once we get a complete submission. And because we've seen this before and spent a lot of time being involved in developing it and reviewing it, Liz is exactly correct. It depends on how much Part 5 changes, not just the enforceable policies, but the plan as a whole. It'll be how easy or long our review would take. So we've done things in 30 days, we've taken 120.
So that would be after the administrative rule.
After LCDC, yeah, after LCDC would adopt, then if the administrative rule is passed, codifying it, then it would come to us.
Okay, thank you.
Excellent question. Okay, thank you. So they only have one slide left.
Yeah, I think it's our last one.
Okay.
So we just really wanted to connect what federal consistency means for this group and future policy planning. And really, I would love it if everyone just kept federal consistency and enforceable policies in the back of their minds when they're making any policy documents. Not everything, not every single word needs to be an enforceable policy, but if there are particular uses that Oregon, or particular policies and ways we want to do business, that Oregon really wants the federal entities and applicants for federal permits to abide by, that's our best shot. So whether you're working on, working on TSB Part 5, or right now going through TSB Part 3, or there's new parts, you really can have a really active role in thinking about enforceable policies.
No, and I'll just last statement to add to that, but I completely agree, and I think the why you should care of all this deep dive into policy here is as you are developing Territorial City Plan Part 3 or revisiting Part 5 or any other policy, if you want to write your own best state policies as you can to carry out what you guys care about, but because the Federal Consistency Authority really allows you to use policies even more kind of exemplified, no, that's not the right word, but amplify. Hold on, I had it, please wait. Amplify. The use and the importance and the value of those. Just that's the lens to keep in mind here. And I am available as a resource to any of you, to the working groups, whatever, to say, did we write this right? Would it work? Can we do it? I'm not going to direct how this group or a working group or anyone in the states developing their programs or their authorities, but I am more than happy to advise if we can how to write it as a really good policy. It will help you not only accomplish your goals, but be able to use it in this broader sense as well. Yeah, that's it.
Excellent, thank you very much. So I do want to one question I received before the session was to say, is there a list of enforceable policies? Can you hand me a list? You can.
For most clearly for the state statutes and statewide planning goals, and the local jurisdictions and are harder just because there's so many of them and they change so rapidly because the counties and cities are always doing work to improve, to add, whatnot. And so I honestly have a little bit of a hard time keeping up with that. So, but yes, I can provide a list.
I don't know generally specifically work. I'm just saying, it seems like when you say it's a collection of sentences, they're kind of scattered through all these resources.
They're scattered.
So the process that we're under with state coastal programs around the country right now is to create exactly this, because this is the ask we get from the federal permittee or the federal agency, like, okay, just tell me what I have to comply with, I'll look at it. It's really complicated. So what Oregon has been doing very successfully for the past several years is improving their website, which lists all these enforceable policies. And the best way to do it is to look at the approval letter that comes from my office that says, here's what we've approved as an enforceable policy, and we lay out a table and we say exactly what the citation and reference is so you can go to it. So it's not complete because they're in the effort of catching up from decades old policies, but it'll be ongoing and improving, and there's certainly some up there right now.
Yes. Excellent, thank you. Karen, you've been very patient.
Yeah, and it's just a clarifying question, really. Given that we don't have Part 5 in place, and given our discussion this morning, that means that Part 2 would be in place if a renewable energy facility submitted an application.
Yes. Did we identify some policies that
part 2 was approved before NOAA was requiring you to specifically call out enforceable policies. Now, that doesn't mean they're not in there, but it just means it's a lot less clear. What NOAA used to do is just approve, say, a chapter like that, wholesale. And we realized how confusing that was to make someone else go through and tease out the enforceable policies later. So for the past decade or so, NOAA's been requiring programs when they come in to specifically line item call out the enforceable policies. So part 2, I believe, was approved before we were asking you to line item it. So it would take a little more work to go through and say, this really is one to meet the federal standards or not, but it's approved.
Okay. Richard?
Just apply to ESA recovery plan.
Can you repeat the question?
He asked if it applied to ESA recovery planning, and I guess I'd have to know more about what you're trying to get at to answer.
Well, the state of Oregon has a management policy on coastal cover, Chaco River, that is directly contrary to what the ESA recovery plan calls out.
So to the best of my knowledge, it would depend on what the federal action is if you're able to review it or not. And so the action of NOAA Fisheries Service developing a recovery plan is not a reviewable action, I don't believe. If there was, there's certain federal agency permits or certain actions that are reviewable, planning is not usually one of them.
Okay, but the action in this case has an impact on fishing regulatory issues.
So the action of developing a plan.
The action of declaring this a coastal coho stream has an impact on what the state can do with respect to enacting fishing regulations in that area.
I mean, you could explore this more. There's not a reviewable action as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, and so the tricky thing about federal consistency is that some the planning documents or administering rules, if a federal agency is doing that, it's not a reviewable action for federal consistency. But I can't say for certain that I'm 100% positive with my answer to you, so I think we'll probably have to review stuff.
Yeah, the designated, I don't know.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Let's just get back to you on that.
Okay, so I have 2 questions from the public, then it's Patty, Walter, Ian. Question is, many of the state's enforceable policies are broadly stated statutes. When these are applied to a federal action, who decides the appropriate interpretation of that broad policy, the state or NOAA?
During I need a clarification, like during a federal consistency review or when they're approving it originally?
Exactly. I think it's both, and they might.
Okay.
I'm not sure where the question came from, but I think both is the answer. So, when the policy is submitted to NOAA for approval as an enforceable policy, we would decide if it's something that the state can legally apply. I think a lot of the really broad policies are written, at least the ones I've seen in the goals and territorial plan, a number of places are really written as agency directives. They're directing the agencies of the state to develop programs, management plans, and develop their own policies in accordance with these broad goals. So those might not be something the state's able to apply for federal consistency because they're really a directive to the agency to go develop something more detailed. And this is where we can get incredibly nuanced, and Liz and I are not going to go there right now. But this is where we kind of have these conversations around how could this be applied so that the way we look at enforceable policies is it legally binding? Does it have a clear enough standard, and can it be applied to someone besides an agency? No, because we're looking at federal permittee or federal agency. So there's that first lens of, is it an enforceable policy? That's what NOAA's interpreting. But if it's been approved as one.
Yeah, so then if it's an actual enforceable policy during an activity, and who decides that they're being consistent and how, if it's broad. So usually, all the state statutes live with our partner agencies. And so we work really closely with our partner, if we're talking state statutes, with partner agencies. So often I'm working really closely with ODFW if it's like the natural resource policies out there for bluefish. And then we might point to administrative rules that are more explicit standards regarding that policy, or guidelines, in water work guidelines, for instance, that would help demonstrate consistency with that broader policy.
So to summarize though, what I hear you saying is that you start by looking at the current suite of tools you have, whether it's law, administrative rules, plans like territorial sea plan, you submit it to Chris, NOAA, and then NOAA comes back and says, we agree or don't agree, and you guys go back and forth.
For the original incorporation and selection of enforceable policies, yes.
Once a policy is approved by NOAA for use as an enforceable policy for federal consistency, we do not get involved in the interpretation of how the state is actually doing their consistency reviews and using it thereafter. The only time it would come back to NOAA to weigh in is if there was an objection and an appeal that went to the Secretary of Commerce.
Can I just add a little bit to that? When I was in that position years ago, and when Liz is currently in it, though, we would, if we had a question on a plan for federal consistency, we would call NOAA, and we did that quite a bit, and Liz does that quite a bit. So even though it's our call, the agency's call, if an action is consistent with a specific enforceable policy, if we have a question about it, they've got, international experts on that, that we do request. Then Liz works with really closely if she needs to.
Does that answer the question? All right, another question from the public. Does the NOAA guidance issued during 2012 still in force? It says, yeah, it's not really, I think it is the NOAA guidance issued during 2012 still in force.
I'm afraid I don't know what the NOAA guidance is, but if they can clarify directly, I'm happy to try and speak to it.
I'm not even gonna clarify.
Be happy to. A critical part of our ocean planning process, suddenly we were informed, again in the context of enforceable policies, that there's NOAA guidance. And I have the document on back in Newport. I'd be pleased to share it with people, but it was a very interesting statement coming out of NOAA to the state of Oregon about what we should do with our ocean plan that I've read 1,000 times. One minute I think it instructs the state you must do offshore energy development, and then other times I read it and I go, no, they're kind of telling us if the state decided it wasn't within our interests, we could say no, but we better document why we're saying it. It's about 2 pages long.
No, I recall what you're talking
Yeah,
about. Thank you
yeah.
for that. There was a point during the marine renewable energy planning process that we did provide some guidance around if Part 5 is something we're going to be able to approve or not. And there is a part of the federal consistency regulations that does not allow NOAA to approve policies that would be considered discriminatory to a particular industry or activity. So we cannot approve policies that are wholesale going to not allow a certain activity to occur. We encourage the policies of state rights to be
So Chris, is
based
that
on
in the
facts.
CFR somewhere? Where does that come from?
I'll be happy to provide
let's
you more
follow up
information
on
on that
that.
later, yeah. So anyway, we cannot approve policies that are discriminatory or wholesale prohibitions on user activities. And so my advice and guidance during that part of Part 5, because I was involved heavily then, was that if the state wants to regulate offshore renewable energy and have policies around this, you do need to allow for legitimate places for marine renewable energy to occur while also being able to regulate in other areas. It can't be essentially a prohibition. Well, the state could do it, it just wouldn't be approvable by us, and I think that's where you were hearing that difference. The state can prohibit an activity if you want to, it just wouldn't be a policy NOAA could approve for use for federal consistency.
So Chris, can I ask a follow-on question related to oil and gas?
Yep.
So my understanding is, for example, New Jersey passed a bill which basically prohibits oil and gas development in their state waters. And also, I don't know the statute, but it basically says that, anything in related states that affects their coastal zone, they also have an opportunity to review. And, as well as any activities, happening all over. It's very broad.
Yep.
So, so the state legislature there prohibited oil and gas. Is that, and you're saying that that's fine, they did that, but it doesn't become an enforceable policy?
They cannot use that for federal consistency, that's not something our program could approve.
And can they use it for federal consistency to look at adjacent state activities that might affect?
No,
their
it's not
coastal zone?
approved, that would not be an approved policy of their state coastal program. So whether they're looking within their own coastal zone or to neighboring states or outside their territorial sea or their country, it wouldn't be a policy they could use under their federal consistency authority.
But they could use enforceable policies, for example, if they had others like an oil spill happening in I don't know, on the Columbia River, affects our wildlife and this and that. those enforceable policies could be applied, just not that particular statute.
Absolutely, so if a policy is written to address the effects of the industry or activity you're concerned about, so if you're concerned about oil and gas, write your policies to address the effects you're concerned about. We're concerned about smothering of habitat, contamination of the beaches, effects on recreation and tourism. Write policies that say no activity shall occur in the state of Oregon that will cover our beaches in oil. That's probably the best example right now, but you can't say Oregon prohibits oil and gas and then use that in the federal consistency for federal consistency.
That's very helpful to me. Does that answer your question, Anna?
It begs
You
a
guys might
million
need to talk
questions, and
offline.
it begs a number of very important policy questions that I think need to be explored further with the congressional delegation and with all Oregonians about if we're supposed to believe that this is really, we just need to understand what these things will and won't do and have a clear-eyed view about how we're protected or not protected and whether or not any of this is going to make a damn bit of difference to the Department of Interior, which has a very, very pro-development agenda. So, but these are great conversations. I'm glad we're talking about them, and I think this is really getting to the heart of where the rubber hits the road on all these issues. So, thank you.
Agreed. That's why we're having a session, just dedicated. I think, is Patty next? Then Andy, then Charlie.
I'm going back a little bit to a question you asked Gina, I think, about how would somebody know what enforceable policies to apply. Liz does work with applicants to say, okay, here's the list of enforceable policies that you need review, especially for large projects. She's been working a lot with the state agencies, and Jordan Cove, for example, making sure they know what enforceable policies they have, and that the applicant knows what enforceable policies apply to them. So she works with them, and we're trying to get the most about today those that we can on the website too, so somebody can just look there ultimately, but that's gonna be a ways off. And the other thing I wanted to add is right now, we only have one geographic location description. Remember, that's policy speak for the ability to review for federal consistency outside of our coastal zone. We have one right now for marine renewable energy, and we have plans in the next year to develop one for oil and gas. We didn't think we needed one before because Oregon wasn't really being looked at for that, but now we realize, well, we probably need to have one. So just so folks know, that's something that we're planning to do in the next year. It's actually in our grant that we have with NOAA for this year.
Can I ask one quick question, maybe as a follow-up? I also had the question of how does the Geographic, or the GLDs is up there, how does that relate to the ocean stewardship area? Like, there's no sort of binding nexus with that ocean stewardship area and these enforceable policies, is that correct?
That's correct, and Andy can add on to this, but the GLD is a smaller version of the stewardship area. It doesn't include everything that's in the stewardship area, because we do have to justify what the area that we include with coastal. We have to have an analysis of effects and resources that are there. Fish and Wildlife help us immensely with that, so we can't just include everything. We have to have specific justification for that use and for the effects that are anticipated, why we pick that area. We couldn't just pick somewhere where you could possibly develop marine renewable energy, for example. So it doesn't include all of the that stewardship area.
Andy?
Yeah, thank you. This is a question from our public audience from Delia Kelly. And she asked us to follow up on Karen's question about Part 5 and with the amendments being invalid, we would then use the 2009 version of Part 5, ? And so the question is the 2009 version approved by NOAA? And the answer is no. We did not submit that because in the 2009 time period, we did not have the developed standards written for the spatial framework that we felt we would need to make this Part 5 enforceable. So.
Excellent question. Charlie, are you still up or?
Sure, just a quick clarification. One, I think Patty answered on the GLD stuff. Worked on one of those in Washington as well for oil and gas. And kind of ran into the same thing. It sort of gets us into the process. We can't be discriminatory about what types of activities occur offshore. But also with respect to legislation, because there is similar legislation that's going to be introduced in Oregon this year. Just some clarification is that in Jersey, and we've seen this in California as well, what they've actually done is not related to enforceable policy with NOAA, but with respect to their own state's permitting of infrastructure in state waters and within ports. So it's a bit of a Hail Mary attempt to say we will, disallow state permitting of infrastructure where the state already has, specific to oil and gas, where the state already has its own jurisdiction.
Excellent. Is there anyone else?
Next time you're at a party and someone asks you what federal consistency is, you can't say.
Well, thank you both for